Hello everyone and welcome to another really exciting game from the 2022 Tata Steel Masters. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Vidit Gujrathi, and it's a game that you guys requested as soon as it finished. It features a really complicated endgame, but it's really brief but also really complicated. So you guys will enjoy this one. Let's dive straight into it and see what happened and also what does this mean for the standings. So Magnus with the white pieces opens with e4. We have e5 by Vidit, and now bishop to c4. Magnus goes for the bishop's opening, sort of an attempt to try and get Vidit maybe out of his comfort zone. Maybe he didn't check what this can lead to, but of course everyone checks everything nowadays, and it shouldn't be a problem. So knight to f6, we have d3 by Magnus, knight to c6, and knight to f3, and we just transpose into a normal two knights defense with white having played d3. So here bishop to c5, we transpose into the gioco pianissimo, and knight to c3. Now we have h6, h3, and a6, a4. So you will pretty much always see these four moves played when there's a gioco on the board. We have d6, and now the position is a known one. There is a knight to e2 move in the database between Pavel Ulyanov and Linier Dominguez that was played in 2019 that ended in a draw. But here we have bishop to e3 by Magnus, and it is now already as of move 8 that we have a completely new game. So Vidit captures here, we have bishop captures, pawn captures, and now bishop to e6. So Magnus has now a doubled e pawn, but he also has an open f file, semi-open f file to be used for his rook. And now b3 by Magnus. Here Magnus also offers Vidit to double his c pawn, which could be interesting because you already have a doubled e pawn. Why not double white's c pawn as well? So if b captures on c4, now you have this, but this is well, actually good for white. Even though doubled pawns aren't all that great here, you have immense control over the b5 square, so black never has b5, and you have all the control in the world you want over the d5 square, so d5 might be an excellent outpost for your knight. Plus later on you can just play d4 and if anything just get rid of your doubled pawns, or you know, many possibilities here. So instead, after b3 we just have castles by Vidit, we have castles by Magnus, and now as white allows it, we always strike in the center with d5. So e captures on d5, knight captures on d5, now queen d2, developing connecting rooks and defending the knight on c3. Vidit trades, we have captures, and now queen to d6, developing the queen, also connecting rooks, and black can be very happy with his position here. So knight d2, shifting the knight over to d4 square, will gain a nice tempo on the queen, and so f5, we prevent white from doing so. Bishop captures on a6, queen captures, and now queen to c4. Magnus offers a queen trade, and if Vidit accepts, then Magnus will get his semi-open b file. So Vidit trades here, we have queen captures, b captures, and now how do you play this? Well, there are a couple of very nice ideas here. You could start with something like knight to b4, go after the c2 pawn, and then maybe try and force Magnus into a passive position by defending the pawn via the rook to c1 move. But there's also another really cool line that Vidit chooses, and that is e4. So now he's saying that, all right, we're just going to trade everything here, and there's not all that much you can do here. So of course, we're going to play d4. This is what Magnus played, and now another beautiful move by Vidit, f4. So this puts pressure on the base of white's pawn chain, that is the e3 pawn, and if you just capture on e4, we're just going to capture on e3, and Vidit already has a very nice passed pawn on e3. The other rook is coming to e8 with tempo. The pawn will be nicely protected, and this will be good for Vidit. So of course Magnus has the trade here. We have rook captures on f4, rook captures on f4, e captures on f4, now removing the defender of the d4 pawn, and knight captures on d4 while attacking the c2 pawn. So Magnus captures on e4, knight captures on c2, rather not yet, that's a doubled pawn. We don't want that one, we want this one. So knight to e2 with check, priorities here, king f2, and knight captures on f4. And now we have this position where the material is equal, but as you can see, Vidit has 2 pawn islands, Magnus has 3 pawn islands, plus also he has a doubled c pawn. So who is better here? Let's check it out. Rook to b1. First we go after the b7 pawn. Vidit of course defends with b6, and now Magnus again tries to create a weakness with c5. Always makes sense. You should always look for moves like this. You have a doubled c pawn. If you have a chance to undouble it or trade it for your opponent's healthy pawn, you should always do so. So rook to f8, now threatening some nasty discoveries if the knight moves, but just c captures on b6. So first, we're going to recapture here. We have C captures on b6 and now c4, gaining control over the b5 square. And now we're going to try and go after these pawns, because if you just go rook captures on b6, then we play knight to d5 check, open up a discovery, and your rook is lost. So you have to be very careful. So c4 here. For the moment, not a lot of good discoveries here. Vidit does go for knight to d5 check, king e2, and now rook to e8, going after the knight. And now, basically, Vidit is offering a trade of knights to go into a full rook endgame. So Magnus accepts this. It's the best white can do, because this also gives white a passed pawn. So rook captures on e4 with check, king to d3, and this is the position where the fun really starts. How do you play this position? Of course, you could capture the pawn on a4. This gives you not one but two passed pawns, and of course, white is threatening to pick up the b6 pawn, so that's also an issue here. How do you continue playing this? Well, Vidit played rook captures on a4, as any sane person would do. The problem is that's not how you play this. Interestingly, you play this by playing rook f4. It's a disgusting engine defensive idea that says that I played rook f4 and now I'm just gonna bring my king into the game, and I don't care what you do. Obviously, the king can't come any further into the game, so your only move is basically a rook captures on g6. But this will not do. If you play rook captures, then I'm capturing on a4, and now this is fine. This is probably what Vidit had in mind. He probably thought rook captures on a4, rook captures on b6, and that's it. However, after capturing on a4, Magnus doesn't automatically capture on b6. Rather, Magnus plays d6. That's the difference. First, Magnus grabs more space here, and now d7, d8 are already a pretty big threat, which could have been avoided if you transferred the move to white, which is never an easy thing to do. When you're playing an endgame and you can snatch a pawn, you are snatching that pawn. So king to f7, Vidit has to bring the king closer to the passed pawn. Now comes rook e1. Magnus cuts off Vidit's king from advancing any further. And now rook to a5, hoping to get rook to d5 check in to pick up the pawn. So king d4, not allowing this, and now rook back to a2. Now we're gonna have to check the white king from behind in order to prevent any advancement. So king d5, rook to d2 with check. We have king to c6, and now Vidit plays b5. As the b6 pawn is attacked, he now also wants to start pushing his passed pawn, but now the position is winning for Magnus, but it's again not an easy move to find, especially if you have a little time on the clock, which is interesting, as Magnus did not have a little time on the clock. He had plenty of time on the clock. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find this incredibly difficult move to find while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to solve this one, congratulations, you are a true master of the endgame. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is rook to e7 check. It's a move you wouldn't expect, because a good move, a good continuation, or rather a series of moves rarely starts with a check, but here it does. And it comes with a very specific idea. You want to give this check, and after the king moves to f6 or somewhere, you're going to play rook to e4. And this is very, very important. But for you to easily understand it, I'm just going to show you why. Black's going to repeat king f7, and now we're going to play d7. That's the good stuff. And now after rook to c2 check, we're going to play king to b6, and after rook to d2, threatening to pick up the pawn, we're going to play king c7. Rook to c2 check, we're going to play king to d8, and now after Black starts pushing, you can't play b4. The b4 square is covered by the rook, so we're going to play a5. Now we play rook to e7 check, king to f8, and now rook back to e5. You have to play rook to e5. This is super important. Of course, Black doesn't want to allow rook to f5 check. Black is going to play f5, but now we play rook captures on b5, because if you allow this check, then the king comes into the game and then it's all over. And now, for example, a4, we're going to play rook a5, and after something like rook c4 defending the pawn, just rook a7, and the rook to c7 is coming. That's it. This is how we shield our king from any checks the black rook might give us. After g5, just rook c7, and that's it. Once the rook moves, doesn't really matter where, we're going to play king c8 and promote our pawn to a queen and win the game. However, in the game after b5 was played, Magnus did not find rook to e7 check. Magnus played d7 right away. So like Vidit a couple of moves prior, now Magnus makes the suboptimal move, and now it's completely different, because the continuation is exactly the same. However, it takes a different turn at some point. So rook to c2 check, king b6, rook to d2, going after the pawn. Everything the same like we already discussed. King to c7, rook to c2 check, king to d8, and now, if you recall, in that line that we've shown, the rook was on e4, so you don't have this b4 push. But here, Magnus allowed Vidit to push b4, and b4 can be a deadly move in any given position. So now you're already close to b3, b2, and b1 queen. So here, rook to e7 check by Magnus, king f8. Now Magnus goes rook e3. He guards the b3 square. Not all that much to do. King f7, we repeat, rook to e7 check. King f8, rook to e5. So what do you play? G6. You do not want to allow this rook to f5 check. We discussed this in the previous line. So G6 is played, and then now comes rook to e6. Again, if you play rook to e4, you go after the pawn. We just push the pawn. And if rook to f4 check, yes, you now have delivered check, but the rook has to be on the 5th rank, not on the 4th rank, because after king to g7, we're going to play king e7, hoping to promote our pawn. Rook e2 check, we're going to play king to d6, and now rook to d2 check, and that's why it's important that the rook is on the 5th rank, so you can block with rook to d5 check. Here the rook is on the 4th rank. That's why the g6 move was incredibly important. This is something you have to know when you're in a rook endgame. So if you have a chance, grab any book or anything that explains rook endgames. Stuff like this is definitely in there. So king to e7, rook to e2 check, and now after king to d6, we are just going to have a repetition of moves because there's no way for the white king to shield himself from all the checks. So instead, after g6, Magnus played rook to e6. He now tries to attack the pawns here, but now b3. Vidit's pawn is much too fast. Rook to f6 check, king to g7. Now comes king to e7, defending the rook, now getting this pawn to d8, but now comes rook e2 check. We have rook to e6. Yes, now you have accomplished this, but the b2 pawn is already very close. So rook captures with check, king captures, and now b2. We have d8 queen and b1 queen. So now both players have a queen in the game, but Vidit is actually up a pawn. His king is maybe not in the greatest position possible, but it doesn't matter because there's no way to take advantage of this. So Magnus plays queen to c7 check. We have king to g8, and now there is no good way to continue. Queen f7 check. We're just going to put the king on h8. There's not all that much you can do here. Queen guards the g6 pawn, so nothing fun happening here. So Magnus just played queen to d8 check, king to g7, and it was in this position on move 51 that players agreed to a draw, as there is nothing more to be done here. So really a fine game that really shows you how unforgiving chess can be and how unforgiving chess could be if played with the absolute precision. For example, this position that we discussed just after king attacks rook, who doesn't capture the pawn? Who amongst us would not capture this a4 pawn? You absolutely have to capture this, but that's not the way to go. Rook to f4 is the idea, and then we have this again incredible position after this pawn was pushed. You have to go for this rook e7 check, followed by rook back to e4, and then we can shield ourselves from all the unnecessary checks, but also we need to prevent the advancement of the b pawn first. So really a tricky situation, and a detail that that you don't easily pick up. And if Magnus didn't pick it up with more than sufficient time on the clock, then you have a general idea of how difficult rook endgames are. That's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We're gonna check out the standings. I don't know if I will be covering any more games from this round. I will try, but it's not really all the way up to me. So these are the standings. Magnus still leading the tournament with half a point again ahead of Richard Rapport, who got his win today, as Daniil Dubov did not show up. He was tested positive, so he will not be joining the tournament, or rather he might. There are some ideas that he might, if he tests negative the next day. There are some discussions about that, but we'll see. So Rapport in second place with 7.5. Anish lost his game today, so he remains on 6.5. If he won against Jordan, he would have joined Magnus on 7.5. Then we have Mamedyarov on 6.5. With 6 we have Yespenko, Karyakin, Vidit, and Caruana. On 5.5, Jordan van Forest after his win against Anish today. Duda on 5. We have Sam Shanklin on 4.5, Daniel Dubov on 3.5, also on 3.5, Niels Grandelius and Pragananda. So those were the standings. Hope you guys enjoyed that as well. And yeah, really fun game. Chess is just always keeps impressing us, and just dazzling us with all this beauty. And the end game is just so rich and full of possibilities that even if you are the world champion, it doesn't mean that you can just win a winning end game. So yeah, once again, hope you guys enjoyed that. I would like to thank Adam Chaplin, Mateusz Jurriaan, Mike McCafferty, Deepak Bhatt, and Robert Taratun for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this spectacular event until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.